Justifying the Kalaam of Ahlul Sunnah. Kalaam here means the theological rhetoric. That's how we talk about our religious beliefs and give mental proofs and argue. That's called Kalaam. Imam al-Ash'ari said that there are some who made ignorance their capital. Their capital means like their fundamental money. And it was burdensome for them to contemplate and research matters in the religion. They were inclined towards taking religious matters lightly and merely imitating people in their conviction. They defamed anyone who researched the matters of the essentials of belief and said that he is misguided. They claimed that talking about motion and stillness and bodies and qualities and colors, contact, separation, division, and the attributes of the Creator is an innovation and misguidance. They said all of this talk of yours, this is misguidance and it's bid'ah. And they say it's philosophy. Their essential argument for abandoning contemplating on the matters of belief is as follows, but really quick before that. What did they not like? They claim that talking about motion and stillness and bodies and qualities and colors and contact and separation and division, that all of this is misguidance and innovation. And they would say it's philosophy. They say we follow Aristotle. They don't talk about those things because they have a different belief than we do, even though they say they are Muslims. In particular, we're talking about the people who liken Allah to the creations here. As for the Mu'tazila, they would talk about these things. Because talking about these issues is, it goes back to using your mind. So the people who don't want to use their minds are the people who would avoid talking about these issues. So their essential argument for abandoning contemplating on the matters of the belief, contemplating is thinking, using your mind. Contemplating on the matters of belief, their argument for abandoning that is as follows. They said, had this been guidance, all this talk you talk, the Prophet ﷺ would have spoken about it. And his guided caliphs who came after him and his companions would have spoken about it. The Prophet ﷺ did not die until he spoke about all needed religious matters and clarified them with lucidity, yani with clarity. Had it been goodness, it would not have missed the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, and they would have spoken about it. This must be for one of two reasons. First of all, you should realize then that they assumed that the Prophet didn't speak about this. So, this must be, according to them, why the Prophet didn't speak about it and the companions didn't speak about it, according to them. This must be for one of two reasons. Either they knew about it, but they were silent about it, or they did not know about it, and instead they were ignorant about it, and that's why they were silent about it. If they knew about it and they were silent about it, then it is enough for us also to be silent about it. And it would be sufficient for us to abandon delving into this issue, as it was sufficient for them. Had it been from the religion, it would not have been sufficient for them to be silent about it. And if it is the case that they did not know it, then it is enough for us to be ignorant about it, as they were ignorant about it. For had it been from the religion, they would not have been ignorant about it. So whichever way you want to look at it, talking about it is an innovation and delving into it is misguidance. We respond. 1. If what is meant is that they did not have any rational arguments by which they knew about the self of Allah, His attributes, His oneness, His dissimilarity to the creation, the truthfulness of his messenger and the validity of his miracles. So if you mean they didn't have any rational arguments, even for the miracles, they had no rational arguments, but merely they imitated him, this is far from the truth, and it is ugly talk. There is no doubt that they used mental evidence. They were not originally following the Prophet's religion so that they would merely imitate him, nor was he a king with dominion over them so that he could force them to follow him. And furthermore, their own families and communities fought them to make them leave their religion. Had it not been that they confirmed the veracity of what the Prophet ﷺ was saying by evidence, that they confirmed it by evidence, how did they stay firm? So it's not the case that they just merely imitated him. If one thinks about the situation those people were in the beginning, those Muslims at first, they were in very hostile situation. The kuffar were attacking them, boycotting them, killing them sometimes to make them leave their religion, but they stayed firm. So why would they stay firm like that? For what reason? If they have no rational argument, no mental proof, then why would they stay firm like that? It must be that there was something that, and it must be that there was something that convinced their minds that this is absolutely the truth, so that they would stay firm in that hostile environment. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't have any authority over them to make them follow him. Additionally, Allah dispraised those who imitated their ancestors in worshiping the idols. He told us that they said, those who imitated their ancestors, Inna wajadina aba'ana ala ummatin wa inna ala atharihim muhtadun. They said, we certainly have found our fathers on a religion, and we certainly are followers of their legacy. They found their fathers upon an ummah. Ummah here it means deen, religion. Their only answer for their only answer for why they have their religion was that it was the religion of their ancestors. Allah dispraised them for that. It is understood from this that knowing evidence is necessary. Three, and if what is meant is that the companions did not use the mustalah, the terms or the jargon or the language of the people of this science of the creed that we're discussing now, such as jawhar, the smallest indivisible particle, and arad, the quality or the characteristic. Arad means, very literally, an arad is a fleeting quality, is something temporary. So like you would be hungry, then you're not hungry anymore. Or you would know something and then you don't know it anymore. And the likes of that. You'd be moving and then you're still. And then you would be still and then you would start moving. This is called arad. That's the attribute of the creation. And is possible, and muhal, impossible, and hadath, occurrence or event, something that happened, and qidam, eternity. So these are all special words in this science of the creed. So if what is meant is that the companions did not use this jargon, then this is true. And it's undisputed. They didn't use this jargon. However, we counter that with the likes in all of the other types of knowledge. Knowledge that you, our opponent, we're talking to our opponent, knowledge that you yourselves use. So it is valid for someone to say, is it valid for someone to say that it is necessary to reject these sciences because the Prophet ﷺ and his companions did not use their terms? For example, here's the footnote. It is not narrated that the Prophet ﷺ and his companions used the terms qiyas, legal comparison, or mu'aradah, conflict, like looks like two hadiths go against each other. Or shart, condition, and illah, the reasoning behind the judgment. The way the scholars of fiqh use them. Nor that they used jarh, discrediting a narrator. Ta'dil, accrediting a narrator. Ahad, the narrations of individuals. Mashhur, the narration from at least 3 reporters. Or sahih, a hadith with the highest levels of acceptability, as used by the scholars of hadith. It's not reported from the Prophet and his companions that they use this jargon. So will you then abandon the hadith science for that reason? And will you abandon fiqh science for that reason? If not, then you cannot abandon the creedal science for that reason. 4, additionally, one must consider that the deviant ideas did not appear at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As Abu al-Muzaffar said in At-Tabsir, he said, "I'lam anna al-muslimina waqta an-nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam wa ba'da wafatihi kanu ala tariqin wahidah." Know that the Muslims during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and for some time after his death were on one path. Lam yakun baynahum khilafun zahir. There was no apparent difference among them. وَمَنْ كَانَ بَيْنَهُمْ مِنَ الْمُخَالِفِينَ الْمُنَافِقِينَ. And those opposing hypocrites in their midst, ما كان يتمكن من إظهار ما كان يستسره من أخباره. They were unable to show what they had been keeping secret. This means that at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there weren't different groups, different sects. There weren't Wahhabis, Shiites, Mu'tazila, and etc., etc. The Prophet and his companions were all following the same way. All the Sahaba were following one way in their creed. The only difference the Sahaba had was in rules, just like madhabs. They did have madhabs, the Sahaba. But their madhabs weren't organized like the way the madhabs are now. When I say organized, means like very well documented, having many books written in the field, big books and small books and definitions and things like that. But they did have madhabs, the Sahaba. And there were people at the time of the Prophet who opposed the Muslims, who were appearing to be Muslims. But those people were munafiqun, the hypocrites. The hypocrites were people who were pretending to be Muslims while they knew they weren't Muslims. And the fact that they were hiding their reality and were unable to argue with the companions about what they believed, then that disqualifies them from what we're talking about here. So all the Sahaba were on one thing in the creed. But they did have some difference in some branches in the belief. Like, they didn't disagree that Allah can be seen. But they did disagree about whether the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw Allah on the night of Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj or not. So they did have a disagreement there. That's a matter of belief too. But that's not a matter of a fundamental belief. That's a branch. The fundamentals, they did not have any disagreement about that. They didn't disagree that Allah can be seen. They only disagreed if the Prophet saw him on that night or not. And it's possible that they didn't disagree. When I say it's possible they didn't disagree about that, means you could interpret the statements that were narrated from some of the Sahaba in a way that it means that they didn't disagree. But it looks like they did. That's because it was reported from Aisha that she said, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not see his Lord on that night. And others, they said, he saw his Lord with his heart. But it's possible that what Aisha meant was, he didn't see him with his eyes. So if she meant he didn't see him with his eyes, then she's not disagreeing with them. But if she meant what it looks like, that he didn't see him at all, then she is disagreeing. All verses that we have or have not mentioned are the basis and evidence for us talking about what we have mentioned with details, even if not every case was specified in the book and the sunnah. Because any instead of what? Because any intellectual cases that took place specifically during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions, they spoke about it the way we have mentioned. Yeah, and they spoke about it like we spoke about it. Really, if a person saw the hadiths and knows the stories of the prophets, if someone knows the stories of the prophets, and someone knows the hadiths of the Sahaba and how they used to talk to people about belief, really he would see that they talk about belief just like we do. But like we said, at their time, they didn't have as much deviance as we do. So they didn't have to talk about a lot of things that we have to talk about. Who are the Sahaba encountering mostly? They were mostly encountering Jews, Christians, and pagans. They were not encountering atheists and philosophers and people of some different beliefs. A little bit they did, actually. They did sometimes, from time to time, but not like we do. Not like the Muslims who came after them. Not like at the time of Abu Hanifa, for example. So like what then? Let's look at some of those references. For example, so what we're saying is, if you see what did they start with? They said, you talk about motion and stillness and color and separation and division and having a beginning or not having a beginning and all of these things. The Prophet didn't speak about this. The Sahaba didn't speak about this. That's not accurate. They did speak about it, but they didn't speak about it with the detail that we speak about it. And that's normal. Because what the scholars did was elaborate on what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions said. And this did come in the Quran and in the hadiths. So we can see some references here. Here I'm looking at the footnote 75. As for motion and stillness, the origin of that is mentioned in the Quran, like the 13th verse of Surah Al-An'am. وَلَهُ مَا سَكَنَ فِي اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ. And belonging to him is what settled in the night and in the daytime. What ma sakana, what was still in the night and in the day. It could mean what resides. Ma sakana, it could mean what resides. To him belongs what resides in the night and in the day. And then that would include what moves and what is still. And it could mean specifically what is still, not moving. Walahu ma sakan. Belonging to him is whatever is sakana, was still, not moving, was motionless. Then the language would be a matter of iktifa, mentioning one of two things usually mentioned together. Yani, if ma sakana means what was motionless, then it still refers to also, it includes what moves, but it just didn't mention what moves, because they go together. Sufficing with mentioning one because it alludes to the other. Is that clear? Yes, it's clear for you?
I'm not. I'm trying to focus, but I'm just listening.
Okay. Where do you need? What do you need?
I'm just listening.
Okay. Okay. So. Yes. Okay, let me back up a little bit. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about, some people, they object to us the way we talk about our beliefs. In particular, the people who liken Allah to the creations. They say, the way you talk about the belief, this is alien to the religion. Where did you get talking about motion and stillness? Like, don't we say, Allah does not resemble the creations. He does not move, and he's not still, and he's not in a place, and he's not in contact with something. He's not separated from something. He's not big, and he's not small. And don't we say everything that is other than Allah has a beginning? It came into existence from non-existence. And either it's a particle or it's a body made of particles, or it's a quality like color or temperature or texture. This is all the creations. And these bodies, sometimes they're dense, you can grab them in your hand, or sometimes they're subtle like the light, you can't grab it in your hand. So this is what we talk about. When we talk about belief, we talk like that. So Wahhabis, for example, they don't talk like that. So they would say to us, how do you talk about the religion like this? Where did you get this from? This is bid'ah. This is innovation. And this is philosophy. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he didn't talk about the religion like this. And his companions didn't talk like this. So we are saying that's not accurate. They did talk about this. They did talk like this, even if we might talk with more details than they do, because the scholars who came later, they need to elaborate on what was said by the Prophet ﷺ and what was said by the companions, and they need to elaborate when they explain the ayahs of the Quran. But these matters of stillness and bodies and qualities and colors and connection and disconnection and separating, splitting into pieces and changing and all of these things we talk about, that is from the religion. It's not true that the Prophet didn't speak about that, or that the companions didn't speak about that, or that the Quran didn't speak about that. It is in all of those sources. For example, in Surah Al-An'am, Allah says, وَلَهُ مَا سَكَنَ فِي اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ. Belonging to Allah is whatever settled in the night and in the day. So what does that mean, settled? Whatever settled. Anything that's settled in the night or the day belongs to Allah. So if settled here means resides, then that means things that move and things that are still. So it's covered in the Quran. The Quran did mention things that move and things that are still. And it's possible here that settles here means motionless altogether. وَلَهُ مَا سَكَنَ فِي اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ. To him belongs what is still, what is motionless in the night and in the day. So then, if that's the case, that means the ayah is directly mentioning what's motionless. So we did find reference to what's motionless in the Quran. And if the ayah is referring to things that are motionless, then it's also referring to things that move, because they go together. So we did find a reference in the Quran that talks about motion and stillness. So when we say, for example, Allah does not move, and He's not still, because if He moved, He would be a body. And if He was still, He would be a body. We do have source for that in the Quran, in the religious texts. Yes. Also, Allah told us about the story of Prophet Ibrahim when he refuted his people who were star worshippers. And what was Prophet Ibrahim's argument? His argument was that this star that you worship, it went away. So he said, how could you worship that? It went away. So for us, we're saying Ibrahim actually is exactly talking like we talk. His belief is exactly like our belief. But when we talk about that, we're just going to elaborate. Ibrahim's saying what we say, but the way it's mentioned in the Quran is brief, summarized, compact, and has very high style. The way the scholars will explain it for you is that they will say to you, because the star is limited to a place and it has dimensions and it moves and it's still and it changes and therefore it doesn't deserve worship, etc. So we did find exactly what we say in the Quran and also in the Sunnah, just not with the detail we talk, because we need to elaborate, we need to explain. Another example, we talked about bodies being made of particles. We say that every body is made of particles that are so small that they can't be split into pieces. So the Wahhabis and whoever's like them would say to us, where'd you get that from? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't speak about that. And the Sahaba didn't speak about that. So we say, indeed, we do have a source for that from the Quran. Because Allah Ta'ala says, وَكُلَّ شَيْءٍ أَحْصَيْنَاهُ فِي إِمَامٍ مُبِينٍ. It means we have encompassed everything in a clear record. Also, Allah says, وَأَحْصَى كُلَّ شَيْءٍ عَدَدًا. Allah knows the exact number of everything. So, if these bodies weren't made of a specific number of particles, then Allah wouldn't know that number. Yani, it wouldn't have an exact number. In other words, what we're saying is this. For example, so this laptop here, it has limits. It has certain size. This house has its own size. So necessarily then, since this computer is smaller than the house, then it means the number of particles that make up this computer are less than the number of particles that make up the house. Then that means then there must be a limited number of particles for this computer. And there must be a limited number of particles for this house. That means then if there's a limited number, that means that there must be a particle that can't be split any further. You can't reduce it anymore. Meaning this laptop, for example, it can be cut in half. So then we'll reduce it to half. And then we can take that half and reduce it. And then take that and reduce it. And then take that and reduce it. But we can only reduce it until a point where it's so small we can't reduce it anymore. Because it only has a finite number of particles. So all this talk that I just said, this is what a Wahhabi would say. Why are you talking like that? Where did you get this from? What's even is your point to talk about this? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't talk like this, and the Sahaba didn't talk like this. So we are saying to them, you are the one who's blind. You are the one who missed the proof. The proof is in the Quran when Allah says, وَأَحْصَى كُلَّ شَيْءٍ عَدَدًا. Allah has encompassed the number of everything. That means there must be a limited number of particles then. You were just, we say to them, it's just that you didn't want to think so that you could conclude from the ayah that everything has a limited number of particles. That's what Al-Ash'ari was saying in the beginning. What did he say here? The way we read. He said, there are some who made ignorance their capital, and it was burdensome for them to contemplate and research matters in the religion. It was too burdensome for them to put things together and then come to proper conclusions. So whoever did that, they accused him of being a deviant. And here, I'll give you another one. We said, for example, if there were more than one creator, then it means that if one of them willed for you to be alive and the other one willed for you at the same time to be dead, then you couldn't be alive and dead at the same time. So if you could be alive, since you can't be alive and dead at the same time, then that means there's only one God. So if someone were to say, where'd you get this from? Who told you to argue like this? We say, Allah mentioned it in the Quran. لَوْ كَانَ فِيهِمَا آلِهَةٌ إِلَّا اللَّهُ لَفَسَدَتَا. Had heavens and earth, had there been gods for heavens and earth besides Allah or other than Allah, they would have been in ruin. That's the meaning of the ayah. Also another ayah. مَا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ مِنْ وَلَدٍ وَمَا كَانَ مَعَهُ مِنْ إِلَهٍ. Allah did not take a child, and there was never a God with him. إِذَا لَذَهَبَ كُلُّ إِلَهٍ بِمَا خَلَقَ وَلَعَلَى بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. Had there been, then every God would have taken what it created, and some of them would have dominated over others. This ayah means what we are saying. Had there been more than one God, then each one would have taken what it created. They would have been fighting each other. They would have been conflicting with each other, and then they would have been dominating over each other. Or another example here. Now, I'm not reading the footnotes verbatim, I'm just summarizing. Another example. We say, had Allah been like the creation, then whatever could happen to the creation could happen to Allah. Had Allah, for example, spoken with letters and sounds, then it would be valid that He's a body that could be destroyed altogether. So Wahhabi would say, where'd you get that from? How'd you make that leap? So the answer is that the Prophet ﷺ, he said to a man, when a man came to him and said, my wife gave birth to a black child, he was objecting because he's not black and his wife's not black. So he's saying, I think my wife had an affair. So the Prophet ﷺ said, do you have any camels? He said, yes. He said, what color are they? He said, reddish. The Prophet, the Messenger, ﷺ, he said, are any of them dirty white? He said, yes, some are dirty white. The Prophet ﷺ said, how could that be? The man said, perhaps ancestry made it come out. So the Prophet ﷺ said, perhaps your child came out like this by ancestry. So what did he do? He compared the human to the camel. From this, the scholar said, anytime two things are similar to each other, then whatever could apply to one could apply to the other. Had Allah been like the creation, then whatever could happen to the creation could happen to Him. So this is what we are saying here. Those people, they object to us for how we talk about the matters of the creed with this rational argumentation, which is called Kalaam. We call it Kalaam and they call it Kalaam. They say, Kalaam, that's haram. You are people of Kalaam. And we say to them, this Kalaam of Ahlus Sunnah is not haram. This Kalaam, it is really the belief of the Prophet and his companions. Alayhi salatu wassalam. So now you understand what's their argument to us. What are they saying to us? And what are we saying back to them? So let me repeat for you also. What were our answers for them? We had several answers. So one is that we say to them, if you mean that the Prophet and his companions, or just the companions, they didn't have any rational arguments, like you don't have any rational arguments, Wahhabi. Because there's no way he can rationally argue that Allah is in a place. Well, they have something they do, but it's fallacious. It's not really sound. It's unsound. But it's not their first way. Their first way is just they're basically like Christians. Christians, they just open their Bible and they say whatever their Bible says. Doesn't matter how much sense it makes. They say God is the Father and Jesus is the Son, but he's God too. So there's God the Father and there's God the Son, and they accept that. And then you told them, but how could Jesus be God if he's the Son? So you're saying God came after himself and God existed before himself? That doesn't make any sense. So they would say, it's not about making sense here. This is faith. This is belief. That's how the Christians are. So this is how Wahhabis are also. They're basically saying, it's not about making sense here. If Allah said he's over the throne, then he's over the throne. If Allah says he has eyes and hands and fingers, then he has eyes and hands and fingers. If Allah said he comes down to the sky at nighttime, he comes down to the sky at nighttime. Who are we? We can't go any further than this. So that's how they are. So we say to them, when they object to us for our way of argumentation, if you mean that the Sahaba didn't have any rational arguments by which they knew the self of Allah and they knew his attributes, and they didn't have any rational arguments for the miracles of Prophet Muhammad to prove that he's a prophet rationally, then this is far from the truth, and that's ugly talk. So that's one thing. And then we talked about that. And two, we say Allah dispraised those who merely imitated their ancestors. Because when they were confronted by their prophets, and their prophets called them to the right religion, What did they say to their prophets? They didn't say to their prophets, well, our proof that our religion is right is this, this, and this. And therefore, so they didn't have any rational argument. Nor did they say to their prophets, your belief is unsound because this, this, and this. Therefore, rather, what did they say? They said, Inna wajadina aba'ana ala ummah. We found our fathers on a religion. That's all they had. So Allah just praised them for that because they didn't have any rational argument. So that's 2. And 3, we say to them, if you are saying that the Prophet and his companions didn't use the special jargon that the scholars of the creed use, that's true. Like I gave you examples. Johar and Arad and Jaiz and Muhal and all these special words. That's true. They didn't use those. But they also didn't use the special words of other sciences. So there's all sorts of other sciences we have in our religion. There's hadith science, there's tajweed science, there's fiqh science, and there's other sciences. There's also Arabic language sciences. They have terms for all these things, special terminologies. The Prophet and his companions weren't using those words, but you use them. So, do you abandon those sciences because the Prophet and his companions weren't using their special jargon? No? Then you can't argue that here also. And 4, furthermore, we say to them that you have to keep in mind that at the time of the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, the deviance was much less. There weren't all sorts of groups that popped out saying all kinds of wacky things, so that they had to prepare many arguments for different things and talk about different topics. Who are they encountering? The Prophet and his companions, they were encountering pagans, idol worshippers. So they're going to refute them as idol worshippers in particular. Or Christians, so he's going to refute them. And there's in the Quran, and in the hadiths, when the Prophet ﷺ encountered the Christians of Najran, he talked to them and he argued with them. But they weren't encountering atheists and philosophers and people of all sorts of different beliefs, so that they had to come with many different arguments and things like we do. Our case, like Abu Hanifa said, our case is that we have to prepare arguments for a wide array of people with all sorts of ideas. That doesn't make us deviants. So now this is where we are. Thus, there was no need to delve into these terms for the Prophet and his companions. Someone once said to Abu Hanifa, why do you talk with the knowledge of Kalaam and the companions did not talk with it? He said, their example is like people who do not have in their midst those who fight them, so they did not need to wield their weapons. And our example is like those who have in their midst those who fight them, so they had to wield their weapons. The meaning of the statement of Abu Hanifa is that the Sahaba, they did have the weapons. They were absolutely capable of talking the way we talk, with the details we talk, but they didn't have to, so they didn't. And the statement, why do you talk with the Kalaam and the Sahaba didn't talk with the Kalaam? That's general statement. The Sahaba did talk with the Kalaam. They just didn't go into the detail that the later scholars did. All verses that we have or have not mentioned are the basis and evidence for us talking about what we have mentioned with details, even if not every case was specified in the book and the Sunnah. Because any intellectual cases that took place specifically during the time of the Prophet and the companions, they spoke about it in the way we have mentioned. And if it were said, as an argument against the Sunni Kalaam, Al-Bayhaqi narrated from Ibn Abbas with a sahih chain, an authentic chain, that Ibn Abbas said, think about everything and do not think about the self of Allah. So for Wahhabi, what does that mean? It means Don't think about that. Just say Allah is over the throne and he comes down at nighttime. Just say Allah has a right hand. He has two hands and he has two eyes and he has a foot that he's going to put in hell. And he casts a shadow, and don't think further about it. Just take it. That's what the statement means to a Wahhabi. So Wahhabi is going to say, Ibn Abbas said, think about everything and don't think about the self of Allah. So we respond, Ibn Abbas's prohibition here is about thinking about the reality of the Creator. He's saying, don't try to imagine the reality of Allah. That's what Ibn Abbas is saying. And his command is to think about the creation. That necessitates contemplation about the earth and the skies, so to arrive at confirming the Creator's existence. Yani, when Ibn Abbas said, think about everything, that right there proves our point. Think about everything means, look how things move. And look how things are still. And look at how things change. And think about all those creations so that you can conclude that the Creator exists and he's not like the creations. That necessitates contemplation about the earth and the skies, so to arrive at confirming the Creator's existence, and that he does not resemble his creation. How would someone who does not know the difference between the Creator and the creation apply this narration? How can you apply what Ibn Abbas said if you don't even know the difference between the Creator and the creation? When Ibn Abbas said, think about everything and don't think about the self of Allah. If you don't know how to tell the difference between Allah and the creations, you won't even be able to do what Ibn Abbas said. Wa subhanallahi wa bihamdihi.